boundary-pushing, transdisciplinary, hybrid film centered around the raucous activity of a time-bending night in Boston's oldest and most notorious gay bar, the PLAYLAND Cafe. Join me now with a conversation with producer and editor Russell Sheaffer.
And the film that I produced and edited is called PLAYLAND.
So you were the producer and the editor. Can you tell me what is PLAYLAND about?
Yeah. So the director of the film, whose name is Jordan West, and I co-edited. So we'd sort of like tag team cuts back and forth, which was really lovely process. But PLAYLAND is about what would have been Boston's oldest gay bar if it had survived the turn of the century. It did not. It is now a parking garage next to a case bank. But the film is a sort of seance trying to summon the ghosts of that bar. It had been around from the 1930s up until late in the 20th century, when it was ultimately a victim of urban renewal efforts. So the film is pulling in a lot of oral histories, a lot of archival material in the sonic world of the film, and trying to reimagine visually what that space might have been like, or what those ghosts might be that pervade the space.
Are the ghosts haunting the bar?
What do you think? I don't know. What's your take?
It feels like the present looking at the past.
Mm-hmm.
So it really does feel like an imagining of what it might be like.
Yeah.
And so I think it's less, to me, it's less the past haunting present,
Mm-hmm.
but the present imagining a haunting past.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting take on it. It definitely is one of the things that we were talking a lot about in making the film, is that there are some oral histories that have been done that are housed in an archive in Boston called the History Project, which is one of the largest independent archives of any of the LGBTQ communities in the country. And Jordan had been really clear on wanting to pull from those archives where they exist and not trying to fabricate new dialogue, for example, but trying to fill those archival gaps with that sort of more rich imagining. And so there are very, very few photos of the inside of the PLAYLAND Cafe. There are a few of the exterior, but really only a handful of interior photographs. And so a lot of the visual world of the film is us imagining in the present and allowing ourselves to be sort of fantastic in that, right? Like really do the work of world building in a literal way for those areas where we don't have the archival evidence. And I think in that way, maybe there is like a haunting, the present is haunting the past in some way, or our imaginings are being mapped onto the past.
Tell me more about the visual language of the film.
Yeah. Just in broad strokes, in a general way, or what's
What were some of the what was the creative process like in deciding on these particular your settings and these particular characters?
Yeah. Um, so when Jordan first reached out to me with an early draft of the script, they cold emailed me and said, like, I have this project I'm working on. And so we had a meeting. They talked about the idea for the film. And then at the end of the meeting, they mentioned, like, yeah, like I did a year of research at the History Project in a queer archive. And I also have this like 80-page long research document, but it tends to scare people off and I don't want to send it. And I have spent so much of my life in archives. I did a PhD at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. And like having somebody talk through their process as one that's rooted in the literal archive was very exciting to me. So I looked at their research document and their script side by side. And in my first reading through, it was so clear that like every line of dialogue that is spoken in the film is pulled directly from an archival reference. And every character is crafted from this amalgamation of very clear archival sources. And so for me, seeing that very first draft through, it was like, oh, there's so much potential here for totally reimagining what an archival documentary is. Like everything does have a very specific archival resource. It, I think there are times where it's really important that that is demonstrated for you, and there are quite a lot of times in the film where it isn't clearly the link isn't clear, but it's very clear that there is some sort of link that's being mapped on top of this space, and so sort of letting that be amorphous and allowing the archive to sort of really pervade every aspect of the film, I think was a part of the early logic that held through.
Uh, I thought of this film as a sort of meditation, but I think uh, you referred to it as a seance. And I think that really it makes it draws out what this movie is doing
Mm.
because it does feel like a summoning. Can you talk more about the sort of lost history of the Playland?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're experiencing now, and we have been now for decades, is the systematic removal of populations that are considered undesirable from large metropolitan centers. And certainly queer people, people of color are a part of that. And so in Boston, there is a very clear history of like the city sort of cordoned off an area that was called the combat zone, where sex workers, porn theaters, queer bars were all sort of pushed together. And so all of that sort of like adult district was literally placed in one space. Um, and ultimately for minority communities, that was a really beautiful place like to be and to be seen. And the Playland was a place where um, Jordan kept finding like time and again that in people's narratives of like their wild nights out in Boston, it would always end in this sort of shitty bar in the Playland, right? So like everyone's night ends here. And so like that's really fascinating. Beginning to understand a space where there was a lot of freedom to integrate and to be with other people who are like you in some ways and not like you in other ways. I think it was a fundamental part of the Playland's life as well. Um, and then ultimately, the city of Boston decided that it needed to clean up the city, and the very systematic removal of the combat zone was a part of that. So after some very targeted quote unquote revitalization efforts, that same area is now like the financial district of Boston. Um, but up until the 1990s, it was something very different.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you said that you're from California.
I am. I'm from San Diego.
Uh, so tell me how you got connected to Boston.
Mm, very much through Jordan. I run a company called Artless Media with two other folks out in San Diego, and we have spent a lot of our time trying to work with and support both young artists, but also people who are really trying to push the bounds of what cinematic language looks like, how films operate, how we tell the stories that we do. I get the most excited by films that are really reimagining how a movie should work. And so Playland certainly has done that since that first draft. So when we first started talking to Jordan, it was very clear that they were rooted in Boston. They're from Colorado originally, but they had moved to Boston and had been living in Boston and had been working at a gay bar in Boston as a server. And so it was very clear that they had the sort of rooting in space. They had done this year of archival research in an archive there. And then we could sort of come in and help imagine with them how the film would work and then support its creation.
Okay, that's awesome. I don't think I have any other questions other than, is there anything that you want to share about this film that's particularly meaningful to you?
Oh man. I think I hope that when people watch it, it is absolutely a strange film at its core. And it's really trying to do something different. So I hope that when people encounter it, they kind of let it teach them how to watch it for a while.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hope you guys get lots of things for it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hope so too.